International relations has always been a core field of inquiry in political science. No state exists in a vacuum. The world is full of distinct political entities that compete and cooperate with one another in pursuit of an infinity of interests. Modern history is the history of the international state system. Since the 17th century, first the modern state and then the nation state became the default units of international affairs. How states find ways to live together, or fail to do so, is what international relations seeks to understand. There are a few major schools of thought that dominate contemporary international studies. Today we will focus on the school that is most influential in shaping both the policy of states as well as popular attitudes toward international relations. The dominant school of thought is generally referred to as realism. Realism has a long history in political philosophy as well as the historical record, and its stark ruthlessness provides a sharp contrast to the idealistic rhetoric that politicians often use when justifying foreign policies. As a theory of politics, realism developed in classical Greece during the long Peloponnesian War between the empires of Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta had led the Greek coalition that defeated the Persian invasion, and on this basis, the two powers spent subsequent decades building rival empires that subordinated dozens of other Greek cities. Athens controlled a naval empire built on trade, while Sparta dominated a land based empire that sustained a powerful army. Disputes over trade routes and over petty alliances, compounded by a general fear each power had of the other's intentions, led to a war that would last for nearly 30 years. The Peloponnesian War devastated Greece. Cities were burned, civilians were massacred, armies and fleets were entirely destroyed. Sparta ultimately defeated Athens, but the victory was short lived. An exhausted Greek world had yet to recover from the fighting before it was overrun by Alexander the Great's Macedonians and turned into a province of his world spanning empire. The Athenian general and historian Thucydides, a generation older than Aristotle, wrote a history of the war that explained its course in terms of a stark realism. According to Thucydides, the war was inevitable because it is in the nature of states to violently contend with one another. Their conditions of existence allow them no other choice. Thucydides illustrates this claim with examples drawn from the war, most famously in a passage referred to as the Melian Dialogue. The small Greek island city of Melos had tried to stay neutral in the war. Many similarly small cities, as allies of either Sparta or Greece, were compelled to provide men and money to the war effort, and since these cities were weak targets, they were also regularly attacked. The policy of Melos was to avoid this fate by any means necessary. But Melos was within the Athenian sphere of influence, and in 416 BC, an Athenian delegation arrived on the island with an ultimatum: submit to Athens and become a tributary state, or be destroyed. The Melians argued that their neutrality protected them. They took no side in the war, they did not help or harm either great power. Why was this not enough? The Athenians replied that this was unacceptable, since by declaring its neutrality, Melos was in effect defying the Athenians. To refuse to take sides was functionally no different than siding with the enemy. If Melos was allowed to get away with this defiance, it would make Athens look weak in the eyes of its enemies and of its allies. This weakness would inevitably invite attack. In this view, Athens had no choice but to subjugate Melos. The Melians say that they cannot surrender. Their pride and their honor forbid it. The Athenians then make a notable move. They insist that pride and honor would only be relevant if the Melians had a chance of beating Athens. But they do not. If Melos were to resist, the inevitable outcome would be the city's destruction. The Melians will not admit this. They insist on their belief in their own chances, and so fall back on the pride that forbids them to surrender. The Athenians scoff at this. They call it short-sighted and emotional, cloudy thinking not suited to dealing with the life and death stakes of diplomacy and war. The Melians know that the consequence of defeat is the destruction of their city, the slaughter of all the men, and the enslavement of the women and children who survive. That is what will happen unless the city surrenders to Athens without a fight. The Athenians apply pressure by insisting that the Melians look at the situation as coldly and realistically as possible. The Melians then fall back on their last argument: faith that the gods will recognize the justice of their cause and intervene to save them. The Athenians, who worship the same gods, reject this as a delusion. The gods will not intervene, they say, because they have never done so before. Athens had already swallowed up city after city with the same tactics it used at Melos, and not once did the gods thwart them. The reasonable conclusion, say the Athenians, is that the gods have ordained the dominance of the strong over the weak. Athens is strong. The gods favor its empire. Desperate, the Melians make a final play. The city had been originally founded by Spartan colonists, and the Melians say they will appeal for aid to their Spartan cousins, who will defend them from Athens. But the Athenians point out that if Melos was of any value to the Spartans, they would have incorporated the city into their empire already. That they had not done so suggests that they don't value the city. Why would they intervene now? The Melians end negotiations. The Athenians depart and presently return with an army. The army stormed the city and burned it, murdered the men, and carried off the women and children. This dialogue captures the essence of realist theory, encapsulated by the Athenian assertion that the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Thomas Hobbes certainly knew the Melian dialogue. Before he wrote Leviathan, he completed the first English translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Hobbes' own theories of the state of nature and the war of all against all are plainly influenced by Thucydides' harsh realism. In the realist conception of international affairs, while states create oases of law and order within their own borders, states themselves inhabit a world of Hobbesian anarchy. Remember, Hobbes thinks that without an absolute sovereign power to overawe people, they will descend into self-destructive violence. The sovereign authority of a king or a parliament keeps violence in check. But there is no sovereign authority to keep states in line. States are by definition independent and sovereign. Faced with a world of other independent states of greater or lesser power, they will behave as individuals in Hobbes' state of nature. They will do whatever they have the power to do. The strong will take advantage of the weak. The only hope for the weak, then, is to become strong by any means necessary. So warfare is the natural condition of a realist world of states, in the absence of any restraining authority. Contemporary efforts to create such a restraining authority, like the United Nations, suggests how difficult such a task is. John Mearsheimer comes from this realist tradition, which focuses on warfare and diplomacy as the chief activities of states in the international system. He focuses on the great powers, those states with the military resources to dominate others and extend their power over great distances. The European empires are the traditional example of recent great powers. Today, the United States is obviously a great power, as are Russia, China, and arguably the European Union. For Mearsheimer, what matters is that in a world of interstate anarchy, no great power is content with the status quo. All great powers seek to change the existing order of things for their own benefit. So in a world with multiple great powers, the constant churn of competition makes war more likely. The fewer the great powers, the more likely that the international system will be stable, that is, will not collapse into general warfare. In 1914, the competition among the multiple great powers of Europe brought on two devastating world wars. After 1945, the bipolar order of the United States and the Soviet Union enforced the peace, even if that required the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The collapse of the USSR opened up room for new great powers to rise, leading to a multipolar world in which war between states is more likely. This is the case, says Mearsheimer, because Hobbes was right. In a world of anarchy, fear is the emotion that structures all other strategic thinking. Since there is no authority higher than the state to provide order and justice in the world, all states must look to their own defense. Hence, all states are armed one way or another. This might just be nominal, as with small and inconsequential states. Costa Rica has no army, for instance, though it does have a national police force. It does not have the resources to maintain an army, but it also has no aggressive neighbors. And at the same time, it is within the United States' sphere of influence, a power so much greater than Costa Rica that no defense would be possible in the event of hostilities. On the other hand, Switzerland is a small and fairly inconsequential state, but it guards its neutrality by organizing its whole population as a trained militia ready and able to resist any invasion. This may help explain why no one has tried to invade Switzerland for several hundred years. States maintain armies because they fear the consequences of defenselessness. States have a very hard time assessing the motives and plans of both rivals and allies. This is why diplomacy is so difficult and so important. Since they can never really know the intentions of other states, but can assume the likelihood of facing armed hostilities, it is imperative for states to maintain defenses just in case. But the very existence of these defenses encourages the suspicions of neighbors and rivals. Consider the case of Iran and its nuclear program. Iran argues that it is seeking nuclear power for domestic purposes, not to build nuclear bombs. The United States and Israel claim Iran is seeking a nuclear bomb. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a state of quasi war has existed between the US and Iran. Right now, Iran and Saudi Arabia are engaged in a proxy war for domination of the Middle East, with major battlefields in Syria and Yemen. In this conflict, the US and Israel have sided with the Saudis against Iran. The nuclear issue is embedded in this context. Consider the realist issues here. Typically, robust military power is the closest thing to a guarantee of security a state can get. The more powerful the military, the more fear it inspires, the less likely a rival state will be to challenge it. Nuclear weapons have changed this dynamic. Since nuclear weapons are vastly more powerful than any other military technology, the states that possess them are far and away more powerful than those who don't. Indeed, one could argue that only those states with nuclear weapons can be called great powers anymore. If a state wishes to become a great power, it must prove itself with a nuclear arsenal. The Chinese and Indian nuclear weapons programs were driven by this desire. Conversely, the much weakened states of Britain and France cling to great power status in no small part because of their nuclear arsenals. So, what about a state like Iran? Iran does not have the resources to be a great power on a global scale, so a nuclear weapons program would not serve that end. A more likely possibility is that Iran would desire nuclear weapons capacity because it believes it is the only way to prevent an American attack or to lift the pressure of American economic sanctions. In this case, nuclear weapons would provide a kind of insurance. The same dynamic holds true in North Korea, where the pursuit of a nuclear weapon was about securing the regime, not becoming a great power. Another factor to consider is that Iran does have the resources to become the dominant regional power in the Middle East. This helps explain the proxy war with Saudi Arabia, another aspirant to regional supremacy, as well as the profound tensions with Israel. Israel has by far the most powerful military in the region, and it is backed by the full power of the United States, as well as its own nuclear weapons. One of the best known open secrets of international affairs is that Israel possesses a nuclear arsenal, though it does not admit this publicly. But Israel's enemies know it has these weapons, which serve as a decisive insurance policy against another general war between Israel and its neighbors. Israel does not want to be the dominant regional power in the Middle East in the same sense as Iran and Saudi Arabia do, but its overwhelming military advantages nevertheless profoundly affect the political dynamics in the region. So, if Iran wants to dominate a region that includes a powerful military rival, it cannot do so without a credible nuclear threat of its own. Stripped of its ideological and rhetorical mystifications, the present political situation in the Middle East is a traditional struggle for dominance by those powers capable of making the attempt. Realist doctrine insists that the focus of international relations remain on these essential dynamics of war and political power. How other paradigms interpret the same facts is a question for next time.